Welcome to today's episode of Awakening the Feminine Within. Today we are diving in hardcore into wounded femininity, what it is, how it looks like in your life, how it came about, how it affects your life as a mother, because it is key. Many of us, now it's not 100% like this for everybody, but a lot of women, and this was my personal experience as well, is that I developed a sense of wounded femininity because my mother had a sense of wounded femininity. And so she, unconsciously, of course, passed that along to myself. And now, in addition to that, there's societal things as well. And as you'll discover more in this episode with Dr. Arieahn, who is our guest today, she is incredible, but she will explain more in detail in this episode. But wounded femininity, what is it? And do you have it? Do you have signs of it? Now, in essence, a wounded feminine energy is when you feel like you can't be feminine. There's a sense of irritation and almost frustration with femininity and anything that's associated with it. It can come from growing up with someone who was not emotionally available to nurture you and yourself. It can come from traumatic experience, sexual trauma, any kind of trauma, as well as like any outside experience that essentially taught you that it is not safe to be you, and that anything seen as that going forward is therefore a sign of like you should be wary of it, basically. So if you feel a lot of shame, if you're feeling a lot of insecurity just in general around your being or who you are or who you're meant to be or who you're feeling called to be, insecurity, there are so many things that come along with wounded femininity. So let me introduce you to our guest today, Dr. Arieahn. She is amazing. She is a licensed psychologist, and she has been doing this for 30 years. She has a holistic practice. So she also does other is not the right word. She does healing work in addition to psychology. So she has an incredible approach because she has the knowledge of course, the psychology, but also of this feminine healing world that I started this podcast to show you more about. So I'm going to let her introduce herself here. Welcome, Dr. Arieahn.
Thank you. Thanks, Miriam, and thanks for inviting me. I'm really happy to share some things today. So as you said, I'm a licensed psychologist. I'm a cross-culturally trained psychologist, so I have a lot of expertise in working with various cultural groups, mostly Indigenous teachers. And I've been doing this work since 1995, so quite a long time. I went in the field of psychology because I felt that it needed a blending or a holistic approach, particularly for women. And I'm really interested and dedicated to not only women's psychology, but also the ways in which nature and horses in particular. I do equine assisted therapy. I've been doing that work since 2006, which interestingly enough, horses are symbolic of the divine feminine. And so part of the work that I do embodies nature, horses, all these different things for a mind, body, spiritual approach to healing. So I'm also an academic. I teach in this area. I write, I research. And last year in November of 2022, I published a book, and it's called Cages, Keys, and the Chatelaine. And it's about the cages where women get stuck, the places where we get stuck in our lives, and the keys to freedom, how we can re-envision our lives and break some of the patterns that we have in our lives, including the things that we're talking about here. So recognizing where our woundings are, recognizing where our harmful family patterns are, because very often we are living out the family patterns that come from, our mothers, our grandmothers, and our great-grandmothers, and all these family patterns have been sort of handed down through the family. And so I'm very, also dedicated to helping people break their harmful family patterns. And by doing that, you heal the limbs of your family tree. So that's a little bit about that.
So all-encompassing and so powerful in how you can help women, because, I love my therapist. She is amazing. But when I think about the context of my own personal journey, I just think of how powerful it would be to have someone who has knowledge of that other, I call it the other side, but because it's just that, and having it be all encompassing and whole, or even say, for example, working with you as a coach and knowing that, your psychology background, I can only imagine how powerful it is for your clients who are coming to you, with that work, because it's amazing with your background. So one of the first things that I think for the audience is going to be important to know is, how would you describe, definition-wise, what wounded femininity is?
That's a great question, because I think about it in two different ways. One would be sort of the collective unconscious feminine wound, right? So as humanity has a collective unconscious, and we have a feminine unconscious and what I would call a feminine soul wound. So throughout history, through thousands of years of history, there are so many core woundings that have happened to women that I think we do tap into this collective unconscious. I think at certain times, we are more sensitive to that in our lives, but I think that's one aspect of the wounded feminine. And then I think the other is the personal wounded feminine. So we have sort of our own internal experiences that we've had. And like I mentioned a minute ago, we have our family patterns that have been passed down to us. So I also, since I really like to make connections to nature, women have always been connected to nature because we bear children. We're just always intricately linked to the fate of nature. And so the things that we would consider patriarchal, mindset or worldview, and some of the dominating paradigms and ways in which cultures have lived for the last couple thousand years have not only been harmful for women, but it's been really harmful for the earth. And, the earth is a feminine energy as well. So I think of all of the damage that this imbalance has caused. And I do want to mention that it's just as harmful to women as it is to boys and men in our lives, because they are also victimized by the same system that, oppresses women. So it's not just women that are wounded, it's also the men in our lives. I believe that we all have a feminine energy and we all have a masculine energy. And so the goal is to have those two energies be imbalanced, and not only imbalanced within us, but balanced within the society in which we live, balanced within the culture, balanced within the earth. And I think when for a very long time things have been out of balance, and it's caused great suffering. It caused suffering for every being on the planet. And I think that I understand, some of the predictions of a lot of spiritual people from various traditions are that we're moving to a time of the feminine. And so if that is to happen, this podcast is perfect, right? Because we have to prepare ourselves for that time by first, healing our own wounds. And as we heal our own wounds, it's like a pebble being dropped into a pool. The ripples go out and it heals the collective feminine as well. So our personal work is not just, it doesn't end with us. It has a ripple effect on our on the greater consciousness of human beings. And it also has an effect on our families and our extended families and our communities.
So say a woman is experiencing wounded femininity. What would that look like for her, if you can give us some examples?
I think there's a lot of ways that it shows up in people's lives. It shows up through driven behavior is one of the things that I see, but also collapsed behavior. I think those are the two extremes. A behavior where a woman collapses and she doesn't stand in her sufficiency. So she kind of collapsed. She might have feel very, very trapped and stuck because she gives up, her own power and her own sufficiency. So I think that's probably one way that it manifests. And I think the other is just driven behavior, trying to be everything to everyone, putting herself last, working to the point of exhaustion. I think those are very common responses. But as I was preparing for our talk today, I was thinking the way that this shows up for professional women that I work with, and that is women that go into leadership roles in let's say corporate America, or they're in a profession that's dominated by masculine energies, and sometimes toxic masculine energies. Women very often, in order to survive in those environments, we co-opt masculine ways of operating, and I think we do that to it harms us, because we're so out of balance then that we're not using any of our feminine energy at all. And I think that's why we see women that very successful women that just burn out and cannot continue to operate in that way. I also think that it impacts how we raise our kids. I think it impacts how we raise our girls and our boys, because we are imprinting them with the way that we're living in the world, and things that we our speech, the things we say, how we behave, how we carry ourselves. And I think those cycles perpetuate themselves, because our young girls and our little boys are watching us. And so I think that that's part of the challenge too, is how do we parent differently so that we can the next generations can do this so much better than we have.
Okay, so I am obsessed with everything that you're saying here. So for a woman that is experiencing, or I might identify with the different ways that you've explained of wounded femininity, and in the context of, raising children, what might it look like for a woman to raise a child or raise a family being in her wounded masculine in comparison to what it might look like when she's raising a family from her healed feminine?
That's a great question. So I think a lot of times as young mothers, if we don't address our core woundings, we pass those woundings onto our kids. We're not doing it on purpose. It's just the way that these kinds of things work. It's the way that family patterns continue, right? If we're not conscious. And a lot of these things, it's because, I tell my clients in my practice, the goal of therapy is to make the unconscious conscious, right? So we take what's underneath the surface, which is 90% of what goes on with us is unconscious, and we make that conscious. So only 10% for most people is what we're conscious of. And once you become conscious of things, you can make choices. You can do things differently. You can be more intentional and more thoughtful about how you're parenting your children. But I think that one example that I'll give is I worked with an elder he's passed on a number of years ago. His name was Nick Hawkins, and he was an Anishinaabe elder. And he explained it very beautifully, and I think this is a good model. And he said, before the impact of reservation life and colonization, the way that the Anishinaabe people would raise their children is that little boys would spend their first 6 or 7 years with their mothers, their aunties, their grandmothers, and they would really learn the feminine, sort of soft, intuitive, receptive side of their being. They would learn the nurturing skills, all of the things that make you whole, right? And then sometime, before they were moving into adolescence, they would then begin to spend much more time with the men in their communities and learn about the masculine aspect of what it means to be a young boy or a man from that perspective. But in his opinion, it created a society that was much more balanced, and it created individuals that were much more balanced, and men that both were very in touch with both the feminine aspects of their being and the masculine aspects of their being. And, what a lot of people also don't know is that many Native American cultures in North America were very gender fluid, which I know we're talking a lot about in my field in psychology today. There was a lot more flexibility in terms of men and women and what kind of gender roles they could have within those communities. And that surprises a lot of people because they don't realize that it was sort of built into the culture. So I think when we think about how we raise our boys and how we even raise our girls, being in touch with that feminine aspect of ourselves and the nurturing aspect, and that it's okay. We tend to raise our boys to be tough, to not cry, to not show their feelings. But then when they're adults, we want them to be whole, in relationship. And I think it doesn't work that way. We have to give them a template to be able to do that.
Absolutely. And I totally see, when you talk about, the ripple effect and how we pass on what we know to our future generations, it's amazing when you explain it in that context of, the importance of, from the wounded and the healed femininity is like, it sounds like when you're in your healed feminine, you're able to sit with your feelings and not judge yourself for what you feel, right? It's okay to cry. It's okay to feel. It's okay to feel that emotion. And if you're coming from the wounded femininity, you're like, no, I don't normally cry. I don't normally get emotional about these things. It's not okay. The permission isn't there. So that makes sense that if you're coming from or experiencing that wounded femininity, that you would then just pass on those beliefs that you have about your emotion onto your children, which is then, exacerbating it's not okay, to feel or to, show vulnerability in your emotion. And so that the way you explained it is so beautiful. And I love that, what you explained in terms of, like the men just being able to spend time with their mothers and, to learn both sides, right? How beautiful and how incredible, and something that we as women definitely should, and this is why I love this conversation, because our healing stems from gaining perspective about what we don't even realize that we may be struggling with, right? So say a woman has inherited, I don't know if you want to even call it that, but a wounded, a mother, or lived with a mother that has wounded femininity. How does she open herself up to being willing to be vulnerable with herself when she feels that she's not safe?
Right. That's a great question, because the sense of safety has to come first. And so when we do deep work, I would liken it to, standing on a diving platform and being willing to jump into very deep, dark water. I really believe you need to have somebody like a therapist or a spiritual teacher or someone that you're working with who knows how to swim, who's not afraid of the dark water and can get you if you get into trouble. But you also need to have that platform, that safety, that sense of, I would call it ego strength in my practice, but that sense of identity and that sense of self that you can climb back up onto that platform when you've dived very deep into the dark water. You have a place to come back to. So we have to really work on that first before a person can go into the deep, dark dive, because otherwise, it can be incredibly damaging, for somebody who doesn't have a stable platform to come back to. And you also need to work with somebody who is A, qualified, but B, also has done deep work and is not afraid of that. And sometimes this takes a great deal of experience, and it takes a lot of courage for people to do this. So safety has to come first. The other thing I wanted to mention, because it came up as I was thinking, one of the other ways that this shows up for women is we develop what I would consider to be passive aggressive communication styles. Because if you think about it, for thousands of years, women didn't have true power and agency in their lives. And so they developed a sort of a passive aggressive way of getting their needs met, of communicating, because they couldn't communicate directly. Women don't know about power. They don't know about personal power and what I would call agency. And so empowerment is also a part of the healing process, to be able to say what is so, do it without blame or judgment, and be able to assert yourself to what you need, what you think, what the truth is. And that's very, very hard for us, because, you think of thousands of years of history, women would lead and lose their heads, literally, or, we just didn't have power. So we had to find sort of, I want to say, sneaky ways, or, less direct ways to be able to get what we needed and to have our needs met. And I think that's a very old pattern. And I think that it's still alive and well in modern relationships with men and women. But I think that's one way that I would call it the covert feminine, or the as you say, the wounded feminine sort of shows up in sort of a passive aggressive communication style. And that's really hard to change, but very necessary.
Wow. When I think of my own, wounded feminine background, and when I think of, how I would communicate, I totally see the correlation in exactly what you just mentioned of just, it felt like fear, and I didn't realize it at the time, but to show up in my own voice and to voice, my concern. But it's also the balance of, being able to take on the consideration of the other person's perspective while being in that fear. And I didn't realize that I could have both, that I could maintain my own voice and not lose it, even while having the perspective of the other person's approach as well. And, I think that really prevented me from getting to know people in the way that would have been beneficial for the both of us, because I just was so scared in how I conversed, or, say there was a disagreement or whatever. And especially with women, I felt like with men, it was like, okay, whatever, I'll just say what I say and they're not going to interpret anything further. But especially with women, I was always afraid that, oh, what if I really speak my mind? Like they're just, either not gonna take it the way it should be, or they're gonna get offended, or, so on and so forth. And so there was just this perpetual, what felt like a hamster wheel of just frustration when it came to certain aspects of communicating with other women. And knowing what you explain now about, the passive aggressiveness of how we've communicated, and just the inability to show up in our power, and also to hold, perspective and openness for another opinion. It makes sense that women would struggle with that. I want to also have you talk about what it looks like, what wounded femininity looks like for women with just other female friendships. Like, how does that play in? Like, how are they either unable to have, or to hold a close connection with another female, or even with their own mother?
That's a really good question too, because, we're social, highly social, and women have what's been written about called the tending instinct, which there's a really good book by that title, but it really says that, biologically, we're hardwired that when things are very stressful, we tend and befriend. And when you think about it from a survival aspect, it's really important for women, right, to reach out to other women, to reach out to our tribe, to our network, to our sisters, to our aunties, to our, fellow women, because there's protection in that. But I think when women are not able to do that, it's because they are so wounded in their feminine that they don't trust other women. They've never had that sort of close experience of sisterhood that's come from either their relationship with their mothers or their grandmothers. And, they're really missing a vital piece of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be feminine in the world. And it's something that can be healed. But I think when women have a very difficult time, it speaks to their relationship with the other women in their lives. And it's absolutely something that needs to be addressed, because there's so much power in that. But I think when women are wounded, they're very threatened by other women. They're competitive. Those are all sort of signs of the feminine being, like you said, wounded and out of whack, right? Because feminine energy is cooperative rather than competitive. It's receptive rather than sort of outward facing. It's more magnetic rather than electric. So there's a lot of things about the energy itself. And a woman that doesn't know how to embrace her own feminine energy is not going to know how to be with other women, and especially women that are in their feminine, because it's going to feel very strange for them. And there's something I tell my clients all the time, and that is family and familiar are the same root word. So our brains tend to recognize and gravitate towards what feels like family, what feels familiar, and anything that doesn't, even if it's healthy for us, we sometimes reject it because it doesn't feel right to us. And that's also why we tend to perpetuate the same family patterns, even if they're negative or even if they're wounded patterns. We tend to repeat them because the brain recognizes what it's familiar, and it will gravitate unconsciously towards what's familiar to it. So if a woman has a very, deep mother wound, her tendency is going to be to repeat that particular pattern with other women in her lives, with teachers or therapists or, colleagues or, friendships or whatever. She's going to naturally gravitate towards those kinds of patterns unconsciously. She's not doing it on purpose. It's because, remember what I said a few minutes ago, 90% of what goes on with us, we're not conscious of. We're unconscious. So through your own therapy work, Miriam, and the things that you're describing, you make all those unconscious, woundings and things that you're working on conscious so that you can recognize it and make different kinds of choices. And you might find that if you have not experienced being with a really powerful feminine woman, you might feel odd, it might feel uncomfortable, you might not know what to do with it. And it's just because you've never been in that space before. It might actually repel you until you get to a certain place in your own healing journey. And so I think that, it's like kind of putting together all these different pieces in a puzzle, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that are not familiar, how would you define a mother wound?
I want to say, I do talk about this in the introduction to my book. We have to realize that for thousands of years, women have been surviving in a world that's out of balance, and where the toxic masculine and the patriarchy have really wreaked havoc with the planet and cultures and societies all over the globe, right? And our mothers and our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers, they basically did the best they could. Sometimes they're very wounded and they don't even know that they're wounded. And they're raising daughters in a way that they know they want to keep them safe. And so they're raising them to be like them. They're, so I always use Clarissa Pinkola Estes as one of my favorite authors in the field of depth psychology. And she says that a healthy woman is like a wolf, and she's in touch with her instincts. And I always think, we don't raise our daughters and granddaughters to be in touch with our own instincts, our feminine instincts, right? And we need to have those things in place in order to navigate the world. But what a lot of mothers and grandmothers do, because they never learn to hone those skills and those instincts, is they just keep you safe by putting you in domesticating you and putting you in a cage instead of letting you roam. But we don't live in a world like that anymore. So we have a lot of women who go out into the woods without their core instincts in place and without the ability to navigate, the world of predators and the world of, nature, because our grandmothers and mothers never taught us that. So I want to say that's part of that's history, and it's what's happened in various cultures. But I think sometimes, a woman that is parenting, and this ties into what we said in the beginning of the call, if she's not doing her own work, if she hasn't really healed her own core wounding, she's going to pass those on to her kids. And so a feminine wound would be a mother who was not able to provide acceptance and nurturing and the things that we think of mothers providing that make us full human beings. A person who was maybe very closed off emotionally and raised a child without that sense of intimacy and closeness. A woman who maybe is hypercritical or very controlling. And, sometimes criticality and controlling behaviors are really coming from a deep unconscious place of trying to keep our daughters safe. And I know that, and I wrote about this because I had, my own mother was very critical, and I wouldn't say she was the most nurturing of mothers. And, through my own work, I sort of figured out why she was the way she was, and did my own deep work on her and with that relationship. But there was a point where I was caretaking her. She had Parkinson's disease. And I remember at one point we had this really nice healing conversation. And she said, I always worried about you the most, and because you were the most like me. And my mouth was agape. I almost fell off my chair because I thought, I am nothing like you. I am nothing like you at all. But in her mind, she really, out of, my siblings, she really saw me as being the most like her. And she said, I was always most afraid for you. And so that was so healing for me, because I realized that all of her behaviors, as harmful as some of those behaviors were, it was coming from a deep unconscious place where she was trying to protect me. And, for me, that was an amazing, revelation that really helped me forgive her for some of the things that she did, and understand where those things were coming from. And certainly, it helps me to be able to parent. My kids are adults now, but it helped me to be able to parent my son and my daughter differently when I worked on those ones.
Oh my goodness. I am just thinking so many eye-opening things that are coming to my mind having you give that explanation, because when I think of even, like my mom, she, again, when I think about, her upbringing, I mean, my mom is Asian, she's Chinese, and there is very much like, you don't have a conversation about emotions. I mean, even affection, it's completely off the table. Mm-hmm. And thinking about that upbringing and how I just, I didn't think it was okay to even be myself. And when I think about what you mentioned earlier about, the history of women and how, this little cage came in to be the standard, right? Like protect women or, protect your children from themselves, essentially, in order to keep them safe, instead of honing, this level of trust within themselves. And, like, of course, children are going to make mistakes, right? Like even as they grow into adulthood. And that is part of the circle of life, is being able to, when you think of, how even looking at nature and seeing how they raise, their animals, like the parents leave and they're like, no, you got to go off on your own, like you get to make your own life decisions and you get to, go and make mistakes, whatever that may be. And when I think of it in the context of the healed feminine, I mean, the healed feminine is there's implicit trust, right? There's implicit trust that, whether in yourself or whether in, say, you're raising a family, you just know either you're able to trust yourself and you're able to trust in just what's meant for everyone around you. And so by being able to trust in yourself, and well, that leads to parenting. Okay, trusting that number one, you've done enough, and number two, that you've done the best that you possibly could, right? In the context of what you've had available to you. And then three, being able to trust that no matter what, your kids are going to have their own path. And that just is what it is, like there's only so much, because thinking again in that context of like, being in your feminine doesn't mean being in control, which also means you can't be in control of the lives of your children. Of course, yes, when they're, young and little, but even then, where is that trust in being able to let them experience and being able to let them be who they're called to be? It's not up to us to decide who our children are, right? Like even as we've grown and as I've, done my own healing journey, I'm like, wow, what would it have been like if I had been encouraged to be me? Like it makes it, I don't spend too much time thinking about it because I'm very fortunate to finally have made my way there. But when I think about it in a younger context, I think about, oh, well, how many more people could I have impacted if I had been taught and encouraged to be me, right? And so overall, in the grand scheme of things, healing that feminine and healing those wounds and ridding ourselves of this historical belief system that's been, trying to cage women into this, boxy standard, even today. And it's like, okay, well, step by step, because it in some ways, looking at the big picture, it can feel like a beast. Okay, oh my gosh, now I'm dealing with generational trauma, and then in the context of motherhood, and then in the context, of society, and how do I, slowly chip away at all those different aspects. And ultimately, and the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you is that, it starts with us. Right? It starts by looking in the mirror and having, as you mentioned, someone to guide you in that process of taking a deep dive into that personalized context of what it was like, for that person, for growing up, and what their, relationship with themselves is like. Ultimately, I mean, healing your feminine is bettering your relationship with yourself and really unlocking you in every single context. And so, say a woman is, having light bulb moments in this, listening to this podcast, and really wants to just start the journey of healing either, her relationship, say, with her mom, or healing her relationship with herself. What would be, and that's a very loaded question, but what would your tips or recommendations be for a woman to just start that journey of letting go of control, of, leaving the beliefs about how to be, or the beliefs that they have about protecting their children, and just getting into that stage of trust? What tips would you have?
That's a great question as well. A couple things is, first, I would start off with this sense that your personal work is not just your work, right? You're doing your work, but like I said earlier, it is going to ripple out to the generations after you and the generations behind you. So I believe when we, in our lives, we have our ancestors stand behind us, and they ask us a couple of questions. One is this the one who's come to break the harmful family pattern? Is this the one? So I would say for you, you are the one. The reason that you were born, the reason you had this sets of parents that you did and the mother that you did, perhaps it was part of your mission, your soul's mission, to heal and break the family pattern. Maybe that's what your work is. Maybe your journey is breaking that pattern, and you had to have those early experiences. So that's how I would frame it first, is that, okay, here you are. Maybe you're the one who's going to break the harmful family pattern, and also for your ancestors behind you and the women behind you, but also for, your generations that are going to be ahead of you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I would do this work with a sense of curiosity, and I would really keep an open mind that people generally, they do the best that they can with the tools that they have. That's the first sort of rule that I would go into. But one assignment that I would give to an early client doing this work is to do what I would call a female amalgam. And what I mean by that is, I would have them journal, because, I'm the journal queen. I would have them make a list of all of their significant female relationships, so starting with their mother, but they might also have, sisters or aunts or grandmothers or female, teachers or mentors. And I would have them make a list of all the women in their lives. And then I would have them start listing what were the gifts that those women gave to them, but more importantly, what were the challenges? What are the difficulties? And what you begin to see is patterns. You get to see in the female amalgam, you will see a theme that emerges, and it really points to what your core wounding is. And that's really, what you focus on. Maybe it's control. Maybe it's hypercriticism. Maybe it's, it could be something else. But that's to really see how these things unconsciously, we keep getting into these same relationships and these same situations until we can really look at it and it comes to the surface where we can see it. And then we begin to understand not just what happened and what the themes are between our female relationships, but more importantly, what did I learn from that? How did this strengthen me? How did this deepen me? How did this soften me? So strengthen, soften, deepen, how have I been changed through these relationships with these women? And so, I really move very quickly. I don't tend to keep clients or people that I either see clinically or even in a coaching context. We really don't spend a whole lot of time in what I would consider sort of a victim narrative. Not that bad things didn't happen, but we kind of move out of that once we realize the impact, because, it's all about forward movement. It's all about healing. It's all about forgiveness. It's about moving forward. So it doesn't condone the things that were done to us that harmed us, but it's a way of freeing yourself from the bondage of that. Because as long as you're holding on to what that person did and how they hurt you, you are always in bondage to that particular pattern. So, and that's why I use the word pattern, because the patterns, we can think about breaking patterns. It gives us a little bit of distance rather than, thinking about people. We think about how this person represents a pattern that we're trying to understand or a pattern that we're trying to break. And it also helps you recognize where those things show up in a lot of different contexts, in a lot of different relationships.
Amazing. Oh my gosh. I just think of, that specific exercise. And if I had that, even before or in the beginning stages of my personal development, how much more clear I think the personal development journey would have looked like, because I would have had a more direct approach instead of, kind of like wandering through like what the result of my issues were in the reality that I was having at the time. Because, I mean, at least for me, my personal development, I felt like I was almost, chasing my tail a little bit of like, okay, well, what is, the popular personal development thing that's being talked about right now? And then I would, go down that rabbit hole and, getting to feminine energy is what really made me feel like I was actually doing true deep healing work. And I felt like I could finally stop chasing my tail, because I wasn't just following, like the next motivational speech or the next, popular personal development talk. And so I love that tip and that suggestion that you provided. And I hope that the women listening will get, a lot of clarity out of that. And I don't doubt that they will. So this has been so eye-opening. I want you to tell us a little bit about your book and how women can reach out to you if they have more questions about, your practice, your coaching work and your book.
Great. Thank you. The book itself it's a lot of personal stories sort of blended with all of the experiences that I've had in doing this work since 1995. And I've done a lot of women's work and a lot of ceremonial work. And so the book really starts off by looking at, I call them cages. It's sort of the places in our lives where we get stuck. And so I list out the most common places in a woman's life where she tends to get stuck. So the first is identifying, the places that you're stuck. The second thing is being able to energize oneself. You have to put your life back into balance physically so that you have the energy to get unstuck and out of the cage. And then I have keys, which are different things that I use in my coaching practice, things that I use in my own life. Everything that's in the book is part of my own journey. It's part of my own practice. When I wrote the book, I realized that I had a system, that I've always had a system in place for making change and transformation. And so that's really what inspired the book. Is I've been journaling since 1988, which is pretty crazy to think about. And looking back over those journals, that was how I was able to see all of the change and transition. The other thing that I talk about in the beginning is that I think transition and change is different for women than it is for men, because we are raised and socialized to be other-centered. And because of some of the things a lot of what we've talked about here, it's much more difficult for a woman to make change in her life because, she doesn't know how to sometimes set appropriate limits and boundaries, and she doesn't know how to put her dreams, desires, and needs first, right? The worst thing you can call a woman is selfish. And so, the book really takes women through my journey, but with the goal in mind of kind of asking them questions about their own personal journey and how they can identify the places that resonate with them where they feel stuck, and then keys of how to use things like journaling, like connection to nature, like developing a spiritual practice, using intuition, the power of intuition. I have a whole chapter on tools and synchronicity and science and how to spark intuition so that you can use that as sort of your compass in your journey, and, all different kinds of things that are helpful. And I have a collective group of women that it's not like a book club. I mean, I think that's what a lot of people initially thought it was going to be, but it's a women's group, and we meet twice a month, and we do hot seat coaching with the women, but we do content. So I usually will choose either something from the book or something that's really resonating with the group. As a collective, a lot of the women in the group are going through similar things in their lives, which just kind of happens, when you're doing group work. And so we'll do some content, and then sometimes the women will share content as well. But that's been an amazing thing, being able to use technology to do that. And like I said, I've been doing this kind of work since 1995, but I was always doing it in a face-to-face space. But now, since the pandemic, I've been doing everything remote. I didn't know how that was going to work, but it's worked really, really well. So I have a website. I have an Instagram with my author for my author page, and an author Facebook, which I can provide to you. And, you can purchase the book on any major online retailer. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. It's very easy to find. So I have an e-copy, and I also have a print copy. So
amazing. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and sharing more about this wounded femininity, because for me, even through my own experiences and hearing you talk today, it has been nothing but eye-opening. And so I hope it has been the same for the women listening. And I appreciate having you on here today.
Thanks, Miriam. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Awesome. If you had a lot of light bulb moments from today's podcast episode, come and join us in my Facebook group, The Intuitive Woman. It is a place for you to, number one, feel safe. Number two, you will absolutely not be judged for anything that you are wanting to share. And number three, to feel a sense of, I'm not the only one who is struggling with this. Now, it's very common for us as women to think that we're the only ones who are dealing with the problem that we are struggling with. And I totally get you. And you won't know unless you share. And it's a good baby step into being vulnerable, to opening that door to more feminine energy and opening that door to listening to yourself, to hearing to what you have to say. You can use that Facebook group as a journal if you would like, in order to get started and to feel like you're in a safe place with other women who are wanting the same outcome as well. So come and join us in that Facebook group. Now, if you are a woman who is really lit up by today's episode, and you want to dive more into healing that wounded feminine, and you are wanting help in observing it, seeing it, really to chip away at that healing, then absolutely visit my website, miriambulcher.com/awakening the feminine within. There are different ways in which I coach and help women to heal their wounded feminine side, to get to not only welcoming themselves, but to really unlock that feminine intuition, which will lead you to an incredible life that you always dream of having. More money, more desire, more pleasure, more joy, more contentment, just to have a spark and to enjoy every step of the process. So if that's something that you are looking for, definitely visit my website, or you can just reach out to me on Facebook or in our Facebook group. It would be an absolute pleasure to chat with you and connect with you more. Follow us on socials, and definitely subscribe if you are not currently subscribed to our podcast. Share it with a friend. This work, as you can see, is so deep and it is so personal. And also, it's so important to reach as many women as possible. So if you are just someone who felt really touched by today's episode, please share it with a friend, and please rate our podcast. If you are listening, if you are watching on YouTube, subscribe and follow us for more. And I will see you in the next episode.